Well, greetings again, and welcome to the fourth lecture in the series of five for the topic, the rise of modern secularism. And we are going to pick up where we left off last time and get started. So let me share the screen with you and we'll get going. All right. Well, last time we were talking about secularization and its effects, and we talked about the manifestos. Basically, we could see especially from the 1930s on, that there were people that were ideologically pushing the idea of secularism or humanist secularism. And we saw some of those in the humanist societies that came out of that. And out of that came the humanist manifestos that we looked at. Humanist Manifesto 1, I think that was 1933. And then the later one, Humanist Manifesto 2, which is the largest. And then in 21st century, Human Manifesto 3, which basically is very much the same as 2 with some editorial differences. But either way, what we're seeing is a movement through secular thinking, and certainly pushed by secular humanist societies, the split between the spiritual and the secular. And here you see a visual trying to clarify that to some degree. For secularism, they only believe in the one side, the secular side, where it's all a material world. There is no spiritual dimension. Reason is paramount. The autonomous self, the individual is the most important thing. And with science and technology, we're going to be able to solve everything, and we don't really need any kind of spiritual dimension. Where on the spiritual side, you would put God at the center, and with humanity created in his image, he's the sovereign ruler, and there's revelation. That doesn't mean reason is left out at all. He created us as reasoning beings. But for what's going on in secularism is they're separating the spiritual from the secular. And then they're saying, well, that spiritual side really isn't real. It's an illusion, or as we've looked at in the psychological approach, the subjective approach, it's something we make up in our own minds for whatever reason, whether it's because of some neurotic issues or because we have a need for a father figure, or whatever it may be. So the secular thinking separates that out. Now, for those on the spiritual side, we don't have any trouble with keeping reason and science involved in things. It's just, relegating any kind of spiritual thinking to something that's not real is objectionable, of course, or from a Christian perspective. So you get this split going on, and what happens is it produces what I'm using here, an excluded middle. I'm kind of using something that Dr. Paul Hebert terminology he used in a different context, but we have up here, you got God and religion, and then self and science down here. And in the secular point of view, you have sight and experience, the natural order, this worldly problems, secular, self-centered area is the real. But if you think about faith, miracles, other worldly problems, sacred, God-centered, this is the not real part, they would say. And so what you get is this excluded middle, separating Christian worldview from being an important dimension of humanity, culture, and society. But the problem with that, as we have seen, is that people are notoriously religious. And this secularization that we talked about earlier, the secularization thesis or theory, put back in 1960, 70, that we'd become more secular just hasn't turned out to be true. It just shows that the spiritual aspect, what they would call the not real, is actually real and needs to be considered. But we don't want, as Christians, we don't call separation. There is where we're both physical and spiritual human beings as God created us, and we can use our reason, we can use science by observing and using scientific method. There's nothing wrong with that, as we talked about early on. But you get this in secularism, you're getting this to push the God and religion further out of the picture. How did this two-tiered worldview emerge? It can go back as far as Platonic dualism, Plato, the philosopher Plato. So in order to explain reality, one must appeal to two radically different sorts of substance. In this case, the material, visible world, and the immaterial substance. And that's how Plato saw the world. And to some degree, we think in Plato's terms of this dualism. And so you can trace that kind of thinking all the way back to that time. And it comes into use in the Enlightenment thinking, where at that point, they make humanity the center. So the most important substance is becoming the material substance and not the immaterial. And with the rise of rationalism, where human reason is the answer to humanity's problems. That Enlightenment builds off of the Platonic dualism to some degree. And then you got scientific, science based on materialistic naturalism, which basically the physical world is all that exists. And once you make that presupposition about the world and take out the whole spiritual dimension, you're only going to think down one corridor instead of with the option that there is more to this world than just the physical realm. But this becomes part of some science thinking. But there are a lot of scientists that are have an open worldview, or Christians or some other religion. So it's not totally that way, but there's a bent in the secularism drive to think more in those terms. As we've seen, then religion gets relegated to a person's feelings or subconscious experiences, his needs or desires or neuroses, I should say, in that. And so what happens then is sometimes religion tends to be reactive rather than engaging secular thought. We're going to disagree with secular thought and some things that are put forward through secular thinking, but this is not new for Christianity. When it came into the world in the Roman Empire, they faced many of the problems we face today, and even more so, as there was no Christian background at all in the Roman world. But we need to learn not to be so reactive, but to be engaging and representing Christ in our engagement. And we'll have a whole lecture series on that. Our final lecture series will be on engaging the secular world. So we will come back to that. This two-tier division that we've been looking at it's given rise to secularization of science. In other words, taking any kind of spiritual ideas out of the equation, and the mystification of religion. Now we know if you're reading Schmidt's book, you you get into the chapter on Christianity and science, and you can see from what is said there that a lot of the early scientists were Christians, and in fact, because of our worldview as Christians, it lends itself to studying the world and using the scientific method. And so it's a good chapter on that of science and Christianity. But with secularization, when they want to take out the spiritual side, this causes what's called the mystification of religion. In this case, that just means you make it sort of like a fable, or a, sort of like the old Greek mythology type of thing, instead of something real. And so science is seen as dealing with the empirical world using mechanistic processes based on the certitude of sense, experience, experimentation, proof from observation of natural law. Well, for Christians, we believe that God created things and he put in the natural laws, and it makes it, it's not chaotic. And so we can study it. But on the other hand, with secularization, religion has been relegated to faith in dreams, visions, inner feelings, subjective thinking, exceptions to natural law, that is like miracles and spiritual realm. And so they push this dichotomy, but in doing so, they take religion and say it's not really real in doing that. And so we have to be aware that that's what's going on in this type of thinking. Where in reality, it's more than just subjective feelings, visions or dreams. It's, God has made it known through revelation and creating us in his image and making us both physical and spiritual beings, that there is substance to it. And that's what we have to engage secular thinking with. So the Christian worldview then should dissolve this excluded middle. We should work to show that, the spiritual dimension is an important part of who we are as human beings and needed in our society, as we've seen what the founding fathers thought, that, without, the Christian faith and principles that go with it, that this experiment of a new kind of political system wouldn't survive without it. And certainly, I think we need to consider the fact that that is a foundational aspect of what makes our country work. But in doing that, we're not going to confine God to the supernatural realm only, or removing the spiritual dimension of our world completely from our understanding. So part of dissolving this excluding middle is to maintain the what we've been taught as Christians is that God's involved, and he's involved in the world, and he's working all the time, and we as Christians, are part of what he's doing. So we're not viewing the world as simply a system of autonomous scientific laws. Yes, they are out there. God created natural law and made the systems work in a specific way. But as you can see, if you get very far into science, it's a very complex world and universe out there, and scientists are always trying to understand it, and they're always discovering new things, and they didn't know were out there before. That's an incredibly complex world, not to mention the fact that humans are very complex. And so it's not just a system of autonomous scientific laws. There's more to the universe and the people than that. And recognizing both the spiritual and physical nature of our world and the people is important. That helps to dissolve that excluded middle. And recognizing God is involved in human history, the affairs of nations, peoples, and individuals, preeminently seen in Christ as the supreme example. This, for those who think along secular lines, this is difficult. But at the same time, it's exactly what we see described in the Bible and what God says about himself and what he's made known in him as becoming a human being as Christ and God who came in the flesh. And so that aspect of what we are as people is to realize that we are both spiritual and physical beings. And secularism wants to take out the spiritual aspect, where we as Christians would say now that is an important aspect of what it means to be a human being. And it gives more meaning to life than just being a random banging around of molecules and things, and with no direction for life necessary. And so that's how you work on it, removing that excluded middle type of thing. So another way of looking at this, the spiritual and physical natures of the world. And of course, what we're saying is it's an integrated, holistic view of reality is what we're saying with an open world view. A closed world view is a narrow perspective of reality. And by taking that position, you rule out anything beyond the material. And but I see Christians and science, being Christian and working in science is not incompatible at all. If you're from a secular side, you may want to do all your science thinking from the closed worldview perspective, but and that would be the section here. But for Christians, we're not boxed in by a closed world, open worldview, but we can still do the same reflection, scientific reflection of the world we can see. It doesn't mean we have to exclude the spiritual realm, and it won't necessarily make Christians' observations any less important. And certainly, historically, as science progressed, Christians were at the forefront of scientific discoveries. All right, so but secular humanism, especially in those who are, it's their main ideology or worldview, they're pushing to remove the spiritual out. Over here, you've got God and Revelation for them. So this is what's so big over here, the reason and self. That's the most important thing. And Revelation, God, well, if you have to have it as a crutch, okay, but for the most part, it's not important. So it's best that it just be eliminated, not that, and just stick with self and reason. Now, a word of warning, there are secular people that are ideologically secular. I mean, they philosophically and by their own admission of the worldview would be secular, say only the material world exists. Though there are a good number out there that live the secular life and don't give much thought. It's not necessarily ideology or it's a worldview that they've thought out. It's just that they live in the material world with just the material world in view and haven't thought much about the spiritual dimension. And the vast majority in secularism probably fall in that category. As you've seen in the statistics, about 15% would be called in the secular or not affiliated to religion and so forth. But only out of that, only about 5% would claim to be agnostic and atheist. So just keep in mind that sometimes people are not ideologically secular. It's just that's the way they've lived their lives and haven't thought much about the spiritual. So for Christians, our perspective is humanity is both spiritual and physical. The Bible says body, soul, spirit. You get the physical aspect of you, and you're an animated being, a soul, and you got spiritual side, spirit. And we believe in revelation as well as reason that God has revealed himself historically and in the Bible and and through the world, looking at the world we live in. So we would accept both revelation and reason. And he created us reasoning beings and created in his image so that we can take from this world what we have, and from that substance create incredible things. And we have machines that fly, and we can fly all over the world. And now we've got sending people up into space, as tourists. It just was yesterday or day before. The first non-professionals flew into space, and they're saying, hey, hopefully in the future this will be common. People, if they want to, they'll be able to fly to space and enjoy being in space and seeing the world from up there. Okay, we can do incredible things, but that's because God made us that way. And so what we have is God and self, and you see the overlapping symbols here, the circles, indicating that for Christians, we're both spiritual and physical beings. And that's what we want to, help people understand and realize that this in no way takes away from the ability for us to do any kind of work, science or otherwise. So important aspect to keep in mind. Another aspect to think about as Christians, because we are involved in church, and we don't want to view a church as a fortress in this world. That's not the way Christ talked about it, and it's, but sometimes we get, this is by Alan Hirsch. We have this idea that you got sacred realm over here on your left, and over here you got the secular realm, and in between you got the church. And the church interacts with God. We worship and things. And he tells us that we should interact with the world, go into all the world, preach the gospel, so forth. But we do that. We also do that just in our everyday lives, work, play, but it could be a mission or evangelism. But really, this is what Hirsch calls the dualistic Christendom mode. And so the church kind of becomes this mediator between God and the world. But that's really not the biblical picture. And Hirsch is right. It's not. And he gives this other option here. And you got the spiritual, church, physical worldview all mixed in here. So he calls this the incarnational church missional engagement, communitas. And what he's pointing out is that God's involved with everything, church, world, and even if those in the world don't understand it, they're still involved. And all these in this church, and everything overlaps. So you get in this center where it's like God, Christians, those who are not Christians, all are involved. And we should have this communitas, community, and within that community share, the idea that there is a spiritual and physical dimension, both are there, and that God is calling people to him, and recognizing that whether a person believes or not, they're still created in God's image, of equal value in God's sight, and that God wants everybody to come to him in a good relationship. And so you have this aspect of the church, but for secularism, we have to be in an engaging mode instead of a fortress mode, to say, oh, okay, the church, we just kind of lock ourselves away from the world. The God's calling us to enter the world like Jesus did and represent him as Jesus did. And we'll again hit more of this when we talk about engagement of secularism later on. All right, so secularism comes from the word from Latin, seculum, meaning generation or age, signifying something that belongs to this age or to the world, rather to a transcendent religious direction. So that's that Latin word is the base for our English word secular. So secularism is a worldview that finds little, if any, place for the supernatural, sacred, are transcendent. Everything is this material world type of thing. So it represents a philosophical viewpoint that had its genesis with the Renaissance and was developed more fully during the Enlightenment period, as we've seen some of that previously. So we come back to this graphic that I've been using. We want to look a little bit at the ideological and sociological influences of secularism. And in our particular culture, and we're talking about the US culture at this point, we have a lot of different sectors, and I've kind of broken them down into 4 major sectors. And I think with those 4 major sectors, most everything can be, in our culture can be in one of those areas. And you have, the knowledge sector, science and reason, wealth accumulation. Then you got popular media over here. But you can see in the knowledge sector, which is one of the key sectors, and being in university now, taking this course, you're in the knowledge sector, and I teach in the knowledge sector. One of the influential aspects of the knowledge sector is the philosophy of secular humanism. And so if people buy into that in the knowledge sector, what they tend to share in their teaching is the only thing that is really real is the physical material world. Naturalism, materialism all become aspects of what their worldview and how they perceive reality. Now, in the midst of this, you see in the middle there, you got the Christian perspective, and because we live, our society comes from a Christian background, as nation was founded. That perspective is there, and it has influence in the knowledge sector, and we should work to influence all these sectors with a Christian perspective or worldview. But realizing that with secularism, you have these influences. Now, beyond the secular, of course, we live in a pluralistic society, has many religious beliefs and worldviews, and so we come in contact with those as well. But because secularism is one of the faster growing sectors of our society, we're concentrating on it. Over here in the science of reason, you got evolutionary theory and materialism, viewing, the world as, having just evolved. There was a big bang or multiple bangs, and, just all blew together, and over time and mutation and evolution, eventually we get, humanity and so forth. And, you study that very much, you realize that it's a very limited theory and full of a lot of holes. But if a person buys into this just being a materialistic world, evolution theory is very appealing. And then on the wealth accumulation, this is where modernization and modernity we've talked about come in, we have a lot of wealth, and that wealth makes us look at ourselves as, well, we don't need anything else. We have everything we need, and we get things we want, and tends to push out the supernatural and looking beyond ourselves as well. And that can be a problem. Now, I do know a good number of very wealthy people that are Christians, and they use their wealth in a good way. And even non-Christians, I see some of the things they're doing to help alleviate problems in the world, and that is great. We should, as Christians, be happy to see that. But in the midst of all these, you got to have the Christian perspective on wealth as well as in science and reason and knowledge sector. And then the popular media, which, can popularize any one of these areas, and oftentimes, can be decide, well, to relegate religion to, what secular side would say is something that's not real, or made up of bigoted people or something like that. But we want Christian perspectives in media to be, to allow media to say things that are helpful to society and honest and fair as well. But out of all this interaction, of course, you have interaction between all these here. That's what these arrows are for. You get the Christian worldview is still coming out, and the secular worldview. But because as time has gone by, this gap has gotten larger with the more influence of secularism, and so that's why we're spending some time with it. All right, so when we want to find out where the term secularism came from, it was coined originally by a British writer, George Jacob Holyoake, in 1851 in his book Origin and Nature of Secularism. And so he coined the phrase, and for him, he viewed secularism as a social order separate from religion, as a light and guidance in secular truth. So separate from religion, he viewed this secularism as a light and guidance in secular truth. But Holyoake did not mean there is not light or guidance elsewhere. So he didn't rule out that there may be other light elsewhere in things. Barry Cosman, in his Institute of Study of Secularism in Society Culture, he points out there are two types of secularism, the hard and the soft type. The hard secularists consider religious propositions to be epistemologically illegitimate, warranted by neither reason or experience. So they just say, to hold anything other than a secular worldview, is just epistemologically. In other words, knowledge-wise is not true, and you're just delusional if you believe that. And it's not based on reason nor experience. So it's not warranted to have anything other than a secular perspective, is what they're saying. The view of the soft secularism is that the attainment of absolute truth was impossible, and therefore skepticism and tolerance should be the principal and overriding values in discussion of science and religion. So their view of it is that you can't really get absolute truth either by secular or any other means, and therefore you should have a tolerant attitude and not just say, hey, secular is all there is. They're willing to have discussions between science and religion. So I think that's an interesting distinction. So you may find some that are hard secularists and some that are soft secularists. Secularism by Max Weber, he perceives secularization occurring because of the consequence of modernity's rationalization, because rationality no longer gave space to religion, thus creating what he called a disenchantment of the world, which means making the world less religious, using the term enchantment metaphorically to mean religion. So it takes out the enchantment or the religious aspect of the world, and because we're giving reason, everything, we're basing everything on reason alone, without the spiritual dimension. So you have a division then of the sacred and secular. Here you have, this is from Peter Berger, secularism, the process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. And so his view of it is that, in the past, Christianity has been dominant religion in the West, and secular removes this position, religion, from this position, and its institutions and its symbols. However, we know that it's still there in many, many ways, and still very influential. So he would say religious institutions have less influence in society. Religious symbols have less meaning in society. And we do see that to some degree happening, and certainly true. an interesting video, if you're interested to listen to Peter Berger now in his an elderly fellow, but still highly active. He gives a he's at a forum, and this video is his discussion, and basically admits that the secularization theory wasn't right. And he said, and he pointed out that we don't live in a secular society; we live in a pluralistic society. And so, you know, but as when he first was writing, he says this. He would say, as there is a secularization of society and culture, so there is a secularization of conscience. And I really, despite the fact that was written back when they thought the secularization theory was going to happen, you know, there is a secularization of conscience. It's not just in society. Our own thinking, we're so caught up in this world and the material aspect of the world that we just think in material terms instead of more spiritual terms. And I think that's still a challenge for us. But if Peter Berger's discussion, I think it was about a 30-minute interview with him, is quite enlightening. He's quite an articulate guy and has some interesting points to make. All right, Yves Lambert in the periodical Sociology of Religion, he talks about secularization or new religious forms, and he talks about the different areas that are being secularized, and I think these are helpful. There's social secularization, in other words, less influence of Christian thinking in society, and we see that, and we've seen that progressively with some of the court cases that they enforce secular perspective. Organizational secularization, less spiritual emphasis in churches or other types of institutions. You know, there are churches that, for the most part, you know, they don't believe in the spiritual dimension that much, and certainly not in miracles or the resurrection and things. And that's an example of organizational secularization that occur even in churches, but also leaving spiritual out of any organization can be part of that. Individual secularization, what we just talked about, the secularization of the conscience, less of a Christian worldview. And so we're, whether we do this out of ideological commitment to secularization or just general living, and we don't really spend any time thinking about the spiritual side of things. So secularization process is emphasis on this worldly orientation rather than other worldly orientation, our own individual choices with no authority above ourselves, and less religious involvement. And we do see that, as the statistics were showing, that even though 76% of the nation, the US, would still say they're Christian, you know, attendance-wise, you know, less than 50% actually attend church. So there's less religious involvement. And so it just points out there are challenges to all of these, to us in the world. And as those holding a Christian worldview, open worldview, we need to be aware of what's going on. We're influenced by these things, and it's around us, and we just need to get our own thinking in order. How do we engage in a world around us? So I like Os Guinness, the book The Call, which you also are reading. Secularism is the process through which decisive influence of religious ideas and institutions have been neutralized in successive sectors of society and culture, making religious ideas less meaningful and religious institutions more marginal. In particular, it refers to how our modern conscience and ways of thinking are restricted to the world of the five senses. So he really does a pretty good job here of summarizing what we've been saying in different pieces about secularization. You know, it's having an influence on religious ideas and institutions, and those ideas of religious institutions and religious institution ideas are secularization neutralizes those, wants to say no, those aren't real, and it does it in successive sectors of society, and it makes it less meaningful to people, and these institutions become more marginal instead of as they were at the founding of the nation. The churches were the center of that community and activity. So he's saying secularization pushes our consciousness to restrict our thinking to this world of the five senses, and so it's a pretty good definition of secularism there. So if we just kind of summarize those in this last slide for this presentation, secularization is this process through which successive sectors of society and culture are freed from the influence of religious ideas and influence. And so there are those who are, you know, ideologically committed to secular humanism. They are working, as we've seen, to influence our culture to go that direction and free ourselves from religious influence. And so that, but a lot of people may live secular, but that's not what they're not thinking about it necessarily. It's a historical process in which religious beliefs, values, institutions are increasingly marginalized and lose their value and importance. So as secularism grows, it pushes those to the margin and makes them less influential and certainly takes out importance. And the whole subjective psychological approach, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to say, well, it's not important. It's, you know, type of thing. And then secularization is associated with modernization, where technology, human achievement are emphasized and thought to provide the ultimate answer. So, so ideologically you have it, but then they look at, hey, here's what we've accomplished. This is where we've seen this in the Bible as well. The arrogance of humanity to think they are the all in all and answer to everything. And God has always said, no, that's not the case. You do have a lot you can do, but there is spiritual dimension as well. So those are the secularization influences and stuff that Os Guinness is getting at in his definition. All right. Well, that will be where we'll leave off until next time. And we'll pick up here for the last presentation in this series, number 5. This was the longest, but the next one is a good bit shorter, and it will be our final series dealing with the engagement of modern secularism from a Christian perspective. So pick up there next time. Have a good rest of the day.